The First Punic War had dragged on for over 2 decades, transforming the Mediterranean into a graveyard of ambitions. By 249 BCE, Rome and Carthage had locked themselves into a brutal contest for supremacy, with Sicily serving as their bloody battlefield. The island had become a wasteland of devastated cities, burned fields, and exhausted populations. Both powers had poured enormous resources into this conflict, yet neither could deliver the knockout blow that would end the struggle. Rome, a relative newcomer to naval warfare, had surprised the Mediterranean world by building formidable fleets and challenging Carthage's centuries-old maritime dominance. The Romans had scored impressive victories at Mylae and Ecnomus, demonstrating that determination and innovation could overcome Carthaginian experience. Yet Carthage remained resilient, its mercenary armies and superior admirals keeping Rome from achieving total victory. In the midst of this exhausting stalemate, a single battle would demonstrate the vast gulf between numerical superiority and tactical brilliance. The encounter at Drepana, in western Sicily, would become one of ancient warfare's most stunning examples of how a small force of battle-hardened veterans could annihilate an army many times their size. This was not merely a defeat for Rome, it was a catastrophe that revealed fundamental flaws in Roman military thinking and showcased the deadly effectiveness of Carthaginian professionalism. The strategic situation in 249 BCE western Sicily had become the focal point of the war by 249 BCE. 2 Carthaginian strongholds, Lilybaeum and Drepana, remained unconquered despite years of Roman siege efforts. These coastal fortresses served as vital bases for Carthaginian naval operations and symbolized Punic resilience in the face of Roman aggression. Rome had invested tremendous effort in reducing these positions, yet both cities continued to defy them. The Roman consul Publius Claudius Pulcher had assumed command of Rome's forces in Sicily with ambitious plans to break the deadlock. Young, confident, and eager for glory, Pulcher represented a new generation of Roman leadership that had grown up during the war. Unlike the cautious commanders who had preceded him, Pulcher believed that aggressive action could force a decisive outcome. He looked at the strategic map and saw opportunity where others saw stalemate. Drepana, the northern of the 2 Carthaginian strongholds, appeared vulnerable to Pulcher. The harbor city served as a critical supply depot and naval base for Carthaginian operations. Its capture would severely compromise Carthage's ability to maintain its presence in western Sicily. More importantly for Pulcher's ambitions, taking Drepana would earn him immense prestige in Rome, where military glory remained the pathway to political power. Pulcher's intelligence suggested that Drepana's garrison was relatively small and that a surprise attack might overwhelm its defenses before reinforcements could arrive. He assembled a massive fleet of 123 warships and loaded them with approximately 20,000 soldiers, legionaries, allied troops, and naval personnel who could fight on land if needed. This represented one of the largest amphibious operations Rome had mounted during the entire war. The Roman plan seemed sound on the surface. Pulcher would approach Drepana under cover of darkness, catch the Carthaginians unprepared, and storm the city in a swift, amphibious assault. His overwhelming numerical superiority would crush any resistance before the defenders could organize an effective response. It was the kind of bold stroke that could change the entire character of the war. The Carthaginian commander defending Drepana was Adherbal, a Carthaginian commander whose name has been somewhat overshadowed by more famous Punic generals like Hamilcar Barca and Hannibal, yet whose tactical acumen deserved equal recognition. Adherbal represented the best of Carthage's military tradition, a professional officer who understood that warfare was as much about psychology and positioning as it was about raw numbers. Unlike Roman commanders, who typically served single-year terms as consuls before returning to political life. Carthaginian generals were career military professionals. They had spent years studying warfare, learning from defeats, and refining their craft. Adherbal commanded not just respect, but genuine authority born from experience. His soldiers knew he would not waste their lives carelessly. The garrison at Drepana consisted of approximately 1,600 men, a mixture of veteran Carthaginian citizens, skilled mercenaries from various Mediterranean peoples, and local Sicilian allies who had sided with Carthage. These were not fresh recruits, but hardened professionals who had survived years of brutal warfare. Many had fought in multiple battles and sieges. They understood their craft with the intimacy that comes only from repeated exposure to combat's harsh realities. Adherbal had prepared his defenses with meticulous care. He understood that Drepana's position made it vulnerable to sudden attack, so he maintained constant vigilance. His scouts monitored Roman movements throughout the region. His soldiers conducted regular drills to ensure they could respond instantly to any threat. The fortifications were kept in excellent repair, supply stocks were carefully managed, and evacuation plans existed for various contingencies. More importantly, Adherbal understood the psychological dimensions of command. He knew that outnumbered forces could triumph if they maintained cohesion and struck at the right moment. He had studied previous battles where smaller forces had defeated larger ones and understood the principles that made such victories possible. Discipline, timing, and exploiting enemy mistakes. These were the tools that could overcome numerical disadvantage. The Roman approach Pulcher's fleet departed its base in the darkness of early morning, hoping to catch Drepana's defenders still asleep. The Roman consul had chosen to ignore traditional Roman religious practices that typically preceded major military operations. When the sacred chickens, whose feeding patterns were interpreted as omens, refused to eat before the expedition, Pulcher reportedly threw them overboard with the quip, "If they won't eat, let them drink." This arrogance would prove symbolic of his entire approach to the upcoming battle. The Roman fleet moved in a long column through the coastal waters. This formation made sense for transit, but would prove disastrous when the situation changed. The warships, packed with soldiers and equipment, handled sluggishly in the calm morning waters. Many of the rowers were inexperienced, and the coordination between ships was poor. Rome's navy, despite its earlier successes, still lacked the polished professionalism of Carthaginian seamanship. As dawn broke, Pulcher's fleet approached Drepana's harbor. The consul expected to find the city drowsy and unprepared, its defenders scrambling to respond to the sudden threat. Instead, he discovered that his surprise attack had been detected hours earlier. Carthaginian scouts had spotted the approaching Roman fleet in the darkness, and Adherbal had used the time to prepare a devastating response. The Romans suddenly found themselves in an extremely vulnerable position. Their ships were strung out in a long column, unable to deploy into battle formation quickly. The harbor entrance was narrow, forcing them to enter in single file or small groups. As the leading Roman vessels entered the harbor, they encountered not chaos, but organized resistance. Adherbal had transformed Pulcher's surprise attack into a trap. Worse still, the Carthaginian fleet that had been stationed in Drepana's harbor was now emerging to meet the Romans. Rather than being caught at anchor as Pulcher had hoped, the Carthaginian ships were already manned and ready for combat. Adherbal had ordered his vessels to put to sea as soon as the Roman approach was detected, and now they occupied the very water space Pulcher had intended to control. The deadly harbor Drepana's harbor, which Pulcher had viewed as his gateway to victory, now became a killing ground. The geography that made it an excellent port also made it a death trap for an attacking fleet. The harbor was relatively confined, with limited room for maneuver. Ships entering were channeled into predictable paths. Any fleet trying to force entry would be compressed, disordered, and vulnerable. Adherbal's tactical genius manifested in how he exploited this geography. Rather than simply defending the harbor entrance, he had positioned his fleet to emerge from the harbor and attack the Roman column from an advantageous position. The Carthaginian ships moved with the practiced precision of veteran crews who had executed similar maneuvers countless times. Their positioning was perfect. They held the weather gauge and could choose when and where to engage. The Roman fleet, strung out in its approach column, could not effectively respond to this development. The lead ships were already entering the harbor and found themselves engaged with shore defenses and the first Carthaginian vessels. The ships behind them were too far away to provide immediate support. The trailing vessels were still trying to close up the formation. Pulcher's massive numerical advantage had been neutralized by poor deployment and Carthaginian positioning. Roman naval tactics relied heavily on the corvus, a boarding bridge that allowed Roman soldiers to turn naval battles into infantry fights, where their legionaries excelled. However, by 249 BCE, many Roman ships had removed their corvus devices because they made vessels top-heavy and vulnerable to capsizing in rough weather. Even those ships that retained boarding bridges found them ineffective in the confused melee that was developing. Carthaginian tactics, by contrast, emphasized maneuverability and ramming. Their ships were designed to be fast and agile, crewed by expert sailors who could execute complex maneuvers in tight waters. Rather than trying to close for boarding actions, Carthaginian captains used their superior seamanship to position their vessels for devastating ram attacks that could hold Roman ships below the waterline. The battle unfolds. As the engagement developed, the Romans found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. Ships that had entered the harbor were being attacked from multiple directions. Some ran aground while trying to evade Carthaginian rams. Others collided with fellow Roman vessels in the chaos. The confined waters that Pulcher had hoped to dominate became a maze of disaster, where Roman numerical superiority meant nothing. Adherbal coordinated the Carthaginian response with masterful timing. He had divided his small fleet into groups, each assigned specific roles. Some vessels engaged the Roman vanguard directly, pinning them in place and preventing them from organizing a coherent defense. Other ships moved to attack the Roman column from the flanks, where the enemy was most vulnerable. The entire operation demonstrated the advantage of unified command and professional execution. The 1,600 Carthaginian soldiers were not all aboard ships. Many manned the harbor fortifications and provided missile support with javelins, arrows, and sling stones. These defenders had clear fields of fire against Roman ships struggling in the confined waters. The projectiles rained down on packed Roman decks, causing casualties and further disrupting any attempts at organized response. The Romans had sailed into a coordinated system of destruction. Pulcher attempted to rally his forces and organize a coherent battle line, but the situation had already spiraled beyond his control. Roman ships were scattered across the harbor approach in various states of distress. Communication between vessels was nearly impossible amid the chaos. Individual ship commanders made independent decisions, often contradictory ones, that further degraded Roman effectiveness. The fleet that had approached Drepana as an organized force was now little more than a collection of isolated vessels fighting for survival. The Carthaginian rams proved devastatingly effective. A well-executed ramming attack could puncture a ship's hull below the waterline, causing it to flood rapidly. Even glancing blows could damage steering oars or break banks of oars, leaving Roman ships crippled and helpless. The Carthaginian crews demonstrated their superior training as they executed these precise strikes again and again, each successful attack removing another Roman vessel from the battle. Roman soldiers, trained for land combat, found themselves helpless aboard sinking or disabled ships. The heavy armor and equipment that made legionaries formidable on solid ground became deadly weight in the water. Hundreds of Roman troops drowned as their ships went down, pulled under by equipment they couldn't shed quickly enough. Others were killed by Carthaginian missiles as they struggled in the water or tried to swim toward shore. The turning point. The moment when Pulcher's attack transformed from a risky assault into a complete disaster came when the consul realized he could not win and ordered a retreat. However, executing a retreat in the confined waters off Drepana proved even more difficult than continuing the attack. Roman ships had to turn around in limited space while under constant harassment from Carthaginian vessels and shore-based defenders. The retreat quickly degenerated into a rout. Ships that had been in the rear of the Roman column, and thus were least engaged, had the best chance of escape. These vessels could turn and row away from the killing zone with relatively little interference. But the ships that had penetrated deeper into the harbor or had been most heavily engaged faced a nightmarish challenge. They had to fight their way out through the same narrow channels they had entered, all while Carthaginian forces pressed them mercilessly. Some Roman captains, seeing the situation as hopeless, deliberately ran their ships aground on the nearby coast, hoping to save their crews even if the vessels were lost. This was often the wisest choice. A ship aground could be destroyed, but its crew might survive to fight another day. Other captains tried to break through the Carthaginian cordon through sheer desperation, rowing frantically for open water. Few succeeded. The Carthaginians showed no mercy during the pursuit. This was not cruelty, but military necessity. Every Roman ship destroyed was one less vessel Rome could use in future operations. Adherbal's men had no interest in taking prisoners when they could eliminate enemy combat power permanently. Carthaginian vessels chased down fleeing Roman ships, ramming them repeatedly until they sank or were too damaged to continue. The scale of Roman losses grew catastrophic. Of the 123 warships Pulcher had commanded that morning, 93 were captured or destroyed. Only 30 Roman vessels escaped the disaster, many of them damaged and with depleted crews. Approximately 20,000 Roman soldiers and sailors had sailed toward Drepana. Perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 survived. The exact casualty figures are debated by historians, but all sources agree the losses were staggering. The aftermath. The Battle of Drepana represented one of the most complete tactical victories in ancient naval warfare. A force of roughly 1,600 Carthaginian defenders had destroyed a Roman fleet and army more than 10 times their size. The disparity in the outcome seemed almost incomprehensible. How could such a massive Roman force have been so thoroughly defeated by such a small Carthaginian garrison? The immediate consequences for Rome were severe. The loss of 93 warships represented not just lost timber and bronze, but lost expertise. Each ship required trained rowers, experienced sailors, and skilled officers. Replacing the physical vessels would take months. Rebuilding the institutional knowledge would take years. Rome's carefully constructed naval power, built up through years of effort and earlier victories, had been gutted in a single morning. Politically, the disaster triggered a crisis in Rome. Pulcher was recalled and prosecuted for his conduct of the campaign. According to some accounts, he was fined heavily and may have faced additional penalties. The Roman Senate struggled to explain how their consul had led such a large force to destruction. Political opponents used the disaster to attack their rivals, while defenders sought scapegoats. The religious conservatives pointed to Pulcher's dismissal of the sacred chicken's omen as proof that impiety brought divine punishment. For Carthage, Drepana represented a crucial victory that extended the war and demonstrated that Rome was not invincible. The success boosted Carthaginian morale and reinforced the value of their professional military system. Adherbal became a hero, though history would not remember him as well as it should. His tactical brilliance had saved Carthage's position in western Sicily and proven that skill could overcome numbers. The strategic situation in Sicily stabilized after Drepana. Rome lacked the naval power to maintain its previous level of aggressive operations. The Carthaginian strongholds at Drepana and Lilybaeum remained secure. The war, which Pulcher had hoped to advance decisively, continued its grinding stalemate. It would take several more years and another major naval battle before Rome could finally achieve victory in the First Punic War. Tactical lessons. The Battle of Drepana offered multiple lessons about ancient warfare that remain relevant for understanding military history. First and foremost, it demonstrated that numerical superiority alone does not guarantee victory. Pulcher commanded vastly more men and ships than Adherbal, yet this advantage proved meaningless when the Romans could not deploy their forces effectively. A smaller force that maintains cohesion and fights on favorable terms can defeat a larger force that is disorganized and poorly positioned. Geography played a crucial role in the battle's outcome. Adherbal understood the terrain, or in this case, the waterscape, where the battle would occur. He knew how the harbor's confined waters would channel Roman movements and limit their ability to deploy. He positioned his forces to exploit these geographic advantages. Pulcher, by contrast, seems to have given insufficient thought to how geography would affect his attack. He saw Drepana's harbor as a target to seize rather than as a tactical environment that would shape the battle. Intelligence and reconnaissance proved decisive. The Carthaginians detected the Roman approach early enough to prepare an effective response, while Pulcher sailed into battle with faulty assumptions about what he would find. The Romans believed they could achieve surprise. Instead, they were the ones surprised by a prepared enemy. This intelligence failure transformed what should have been Rome's advantage, the ability to choose when and where to attack, into a fatal liability. Professional military training showed its value in the stark contrast between the two forces. The Carthaginian defenders were career soldiers and sailors who had drilled extensively in the maneuvers they would need to execute. They responded to the Roman threat with practiced efficiency, moving from peacetime routine to combat readiness seamlessly. The Romans, despite their large numbers, lacked this institutional professionalism. Many of their crews were inexperienced, coordination between ships was poor, and commanders made elementary tactical mistakes. Command and control mattered enormously. Adherbal maintained unified direction of his forces throughout the battle, positioning units effectively and adapting to developments as they occurred. Pulcher lost control of his forces almost immediately, and the Roman fleet dissolved into independent units operating without coordination. In ancient warfare, where communications were primitive and battles moved quickly, maintaining command authority was essential for effective operations. The battle also illustrated the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of respecting one's opponent. Pulcher had dismissed the sacred chicken's negative omen with contemptuous mockery, symbolic of his broader attitude toward the campaign. He assumed Carthaginian weakness rather than preparing for Carthaginian strength. This psychological failure, the inability to imagine that the enemy might be competent and prepared, is a recurring cause of military disasters throughout history. Comparative analysis. Drepana was not the only time in ancient military history that a small professional force defeated a much larger army. The Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE saw a few thousand Greeks, led by 300 Spartans, hold off a massive Persian army for days by fighting in a narrow pass that negated Persian numerical superiority. Alexander the Great repeatedly defeated much larger Persian forces through superior tactics and battlefield coordination. Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul featured numerous engagements where Roman discipline and tactics overcame Celtic numerical advantages. What distinguished Drepana was the completeness of the victory and the magnitude of the numerical disparity. While other battles featured small forces delaying or defeating larger ones through defensive fighting or tactical brilliance, Drepana saw a tiny garrison not merely survive, but actively destroy an enemy force more than 10 times its size. The Romans did not merely retreat or suffer heavy casualties, they were routed and annihilated as an effective military force. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, where Hannibal's Carthaginian army destroyed a much larger Roman force, is often cited as the pinnacle of tactical excellence in ancient warfare. Drepana, fought 33 years earlier, deserves comparison as an equally stunning example of how superior generalship can overcome numerical inferiority. Both battles demonstrated Carthaginian tactical sophistication and Roman vulnerability to skilled opponents. In naval warfare specifically, Drepana stands out for the decisiveness of the outcome. Naval battles in the ancient world often ended with one side withdrawing after suffering moderate losses, since sinking or capturing ships was difficult. For one side to lose nearly 80% of its fleet in a single engagement was extraordinary. This level of catastrophic defeat was rare in any form of ancient warfare and speaks to the combination of Roman mistakes and Carthaginian excellence. The human dimension. Behind the statistics and tactical analysis were thousands of individual human experiences, moments of terror, courage, desperation, and death. The Roman soldiers who sailed toward Drepana that morning were men with families, hopes, and futures. Many were young, experiencing their first major battle. Others were veterans who had survived previous engagements, but whose luck ran out in the waters off Drepana. The ancient sources, focused on commanders and outcomes, rarely tell us about these individual stories, but we can imagine their experiences. The confusion aboard the Roman ships as the Carthaginian trap closed must have been terrifying. Soldiers trained to fight on solid ground found themselves helpless aboard lurching vessels. Orders were shouted but couldn't be heard over the chaos of battle. Ships collided with sickening crashes. Water poured through holes torn by Carthaginian rams. Men fell screaming into the sea, dragged down by their equipment. Others burned as fire spread across damaged vessels. The horror of naval combat combined every nightmare: drowning, burning, crushing, helplessness. For the Carthaginian defenders, the battle represented a different kind of intensity. They had faced an existential threat, a Roman force that could have overwhelmed them through sheer numbers. Yet their training, their trust in Adherbal's leadership, and their professional competence transformed mortal danger into opportunity. The execution of their attack required courage as well as skill. They were attacking into a force many times their size, and if their tactics had failed, they could have been overwhelmed. But they believed in their abilities and their commander, and that confidence proved justified. Adherbal himself must have experienced the battle as a test of everything he had learned throughout his career. The responsibility of command is immense. Every decision affects hundreds of lives. As he watched the Roman fleet approach, he had to make rapid assessments. Were his scouts correct about the enemy numbers? Would his tactics work? Had he positioned his forces optimally? Once battle was joined, he had to observe, adapt, and direct his forces while the situation changed moment by moment. The mental pressure must have been enormous, yet he performed brilliantly. Long-term consequences. While Drepana was a tactical masterpiece, its strategic impact on the broader First Punic War was more limited than might be expected. Rome's defeat delayed, but did not prevent eventual Roman victory. The Roman state possessed resources that Carthage could not match. Rome could afford to lose 93 ships and 10,000 to 12,000 men and still continue the war. Carthage, despite its wealth and naval tradition, struggled to match Rome's ability to absorb losses and continue fighting. The disaster at Drepana did force Rome to rethink its naval strategy. The Romans became more cautious in their maritime operations, focusing on rebuilding their fleet and avoiding risky engagements until they could fight from a position of strength. This strategic patience, painful as it was for a society that valued aggressive action, ultimately proved wise. When Rome finally rebuilt its naval power, it did so with better training and more careful planning. The battle's psychological impact on Roman military culture should not be underestimated. The disaster demonstrated that Roman courage and numerical superiority were not sufficient guarantees of victory. This realization, humbling as it was, helped drive improvements in Roman military professionalism. Future Roman commanders would study disasters like Drepana to understand what went wrong and how to avoid similar mistakes. For Carthage, Drepana provided temporary relief, but could not change the fundamental strategic situation. Carthage was a wealthy trading city with a relatively small citizen population, dependent on mercenaries for its military power. Rome was the center of an expanding alliance system that could draw on Italy's enormous population reserves. In a prolonged war of attrition, Rome's advantages in manpower and resources would eventually prove decisive despite Carthaginian tactical brilliance. The First Punic War finally ended in 241 BCE, 10 years after Drepana, when Rome won the naval battle of the Aegates Islands and forced Carthage to sue for peace. Rome gained Sicily, Carthage paid heavy war indemnities, and the foundation was laid for future conflicts between the two powers. Drepana had postponed, but not prevented, Roman victory. Lessons for modern military thought. The Battle of Drepana offers insights that transcend its ancient context. Military professionals and historians continue to study this engagement because it illustrates principles that remain relevant across different eras and technologies. While modern warfare involves capabilities the ancients could not have imagined, the fundamental dynamics of combat, the importance of training, the value of intelligence, the dangers of overconfidence, remain constant. The battle demonstrates that force quality matters more than force quantity. Modern militaries invest heavily in training and professionalization precisely because they understand that a small number of highly skilled personnel can outperform a large number of poorly trained ones. The technological sophistication of modern weapons makes this even more true today than it was in ancient times. A single well-trained pilot in an advanced aircraft can dominate dozens of poorly trained opponents in inferior machines. Adherbals' use of terrain, or in this case, the maritime geography, to offset numerical disadvantage remains a core principle of military tactics. Modern commanders still seek terrain advantages that allow them to engage enemy forces piecemeal rather than facing their full strength simultaneously. Whether in the mountains of Afghanistan or the urban canyons of modern cities, geography shapes tactical possibilities and can be exploited by clever commanders. The intelligence failure that doomed Pulcher's attack parallels many modern military disasters. Commanders who operate based on assumptions rather than verified information risk catastrophe. The importance of reconnaissance, surveillance, and understanding enemy capabilities has only increased as warfare has become more complex. Modern military forces invest enormous resources in intelligence gathering precisely to avoid the kind of surprise that befell the Romans at Drepana. The battle also illustrates the dangers of linear thinking and template-based planning. Pulcher seems to have assumed that his attack would follow a predictable pattern: approach, surprise the enemy, overwhelm them with superior numbers, achieve victory. When reality diverged from this template, he had no effective response. Modern military education emphasizes adaptive thinking and the importance of maintaining flexibility as situations develop. Learning from disasters like Drepana, where rigid planning met creative opposition. Conclusion: the Battle of Drepana stands as one of history's most dramatic examples of how tactical brilliance can overcome numerical superiority. Adherbal's 1,600 Carthaginian defenders did not merely survive an encounter with Pulcher's 20,000-man Roman force. They annihilated it, destroying 93 of 123 ships and inflicting catastrophic casualties. The magnitude of this achievement becomes even more impressive when we consider the technological context. This was not a battle where superior weapons or revolutionary technology gave one side an insurmountable advantage. Both sides had similar ships, similar weapons, and similar tactical options. The difference lay in leadership, training, and execution. The battle demonstrated multiple principles that distinguish successful military forces from unsuccessful ones. Professional training created soldiers and sailors who could execute complex maneuvers under extreme pressure. Effective leadership positioned forces to exploit geographic advantages and enemy mistakes. Good intelligence provided advance warning that transformed a surprise attack into a prepared ambush. Unit cohesion allowed a small force to maintain effectiveness, while a larger force dissolved into chaos. These factors combined to produce one of ancient warfare's most one-sided outcomes. For Rome, Drepana was a painful lesson in the limits of numerical superiority and the dangers of underestimating opponents. The disaster forced Romans to recognize that their traditional virtues, courage, determination, and willingness to accept casualties, were insufficient against skilled enemies fighting on favorable terms. This recognition, though humbling, ultimately strengthened Rome by encouraging greater military professionalism and more careful strategic planning. For Carthage, the victory represented both the heights of what their military system could achieve and, ultimately, its limitations. Carthaginian forces could win brilliant tactical victories, but they struggled to translate these successes into decisive strategic outcomes. The fundamental imbalance in resources between Carthage's trading empire and Rome's expanding Italian confederation meant that tactical brilliance could delay but not prevent eventual Roman triumph. The battle's legacy extends beyond its immediate participants. Military professionals throughout history have studied Drepana as an example of tactics triumphing over numbers, of preparation defeating improvisation, of skill overcoming strength. The engagement demonstrates that military excellence requires more than material advantages. It demands professional competence, tactical intelligence, and the ability to exploit opportunities when they arise. In the final analysis, the Battle of Drepana reminds us that warfare is fundamentally a human endeavor, where judgment, skill, and leadership often matter more than raw power. Adherbal's victory with 1,600 men over Pulcher's 20,000 was not a fluke or a miracle. It was the predictable result of superior military professionalism meeting overconfident amateurism. The Romans learned from this disaster, and their willingness to adapt to painful lessons was one reason they eventually built history's most successful military system. But on that morning in 249 BCE, off the coast of Drepana, it was Carthage's veterans who taught Rome the price of underestimating one's enemies.